If you think you've seen every important PS1 RPG, this list is here to challenge that confidence. These aren't just underrated games. They're titles that slip through cracks of localization, timing, or marketing so narrow that even dedicated collectors miss them. Some never left Japan. Shadow Madness is one of the strangest RPGs ever released on the PS1, and I mean that in the best possible way. It drops you into a grotesque, decaying fantasy world that feels more like a dark fairy tale than a traditional JRPG. From the first town, everything feels slightly off, like the game is daring you to be uncomfortable. The characters are deeply flawed, sometimes even unpleasant, but that made them feel more human to me. They're not heroes chosen by destiny. They're broken people dragged into something bigger than themselves. Their dialogue can be blunt, awkward, and oddly funny, which gives the world a raw, almost cynical edge. I appreciated how the game never tries to redeem them in predictable ways, letting their messy personalities drive the story. Combat is turn-based, but it's built around mood rather than spectacle. The animations are stiff, the environments are gloomy, and nothing feels glamorous. I like how that reinforced the tone of the story, making even small victories feel hard-won. Battles can drag due to slow pacing and repetitive enemy designs, which test patience more than it probably should. The world design leans into body horror and surreal imagery that wouldn't feel out of place in a Tim Burton film. Some areas are genuinely unsettling, filled with distorted creatures and environments that feel diseased. The soundtrack mirrors this unease, using dissonant strings and ambient noise to keep you on edge. Shadow Madness didn't fit into any clean marketing box, which probably explains why it disappeared so quickly. For players willing to embrace something uncomfortable and weird, it offers a kind of RPG experience that feels almost forbidden, like you're peeking into a world that was never meant to be popular. The Grand Stream Saga is one of those games that feels strangely intimate for a PS1 RPG. Instead of following a huge cast or sprawling kingdoms, it stays tightly focused on one wandering swordsman trying to piece together a broken world. That narrow scope made everything feel more personal to me, almost like I was moving through someone else's memories rather than just completing quests. The world is made up of floating islands drifting through a void, which gives the entire game a quiet, dreamlike tone. Towns feel isolated, and characters often seem cut off from one another, both physically and emotionally. I found myself slowing down just to take in how lonely it all felt. There's very little spectacle here, and that restraint actually makes the setting more powerful. Combat happens in real time within small arenas, which keeps fights tense without becoming chaotic. You're not juggling huge parties. You're relying on timing, positioning, and learning enemy patterns. It's simple, but it made every battle feel like a personal test instead of a numbers game. Boss encounters demand patience, forcing you to study animations and wait for openings rather than brute forcing your way through. The camera angles shift during exploration, which can feel disorienting at first, but adds to the sense of navigating a fractured world. Some dungeons frustrated me with their awkward perspectives, making it hard to judge distances. The voice acting is minimal and occasionally stilted, though I found that added to the dreamlike, detached atmosphere rather than breaking it. The story unfolds gently through fragments and conversations that don't always explain themselves. That ambiguity stuck with me long after I finished playing. The Grand Stream Saga isn't loud or flashy, but leave a lingering emotional echo that few PS1 RPGs ever managed. Alundra 2 is often remembered as a disappointment, but playing it now feels more like discovering a misunderstood oddity. It drops the dark, emotional tone of the first game in favor of something brighter and more playful, and I think that shift is exactly why it lost so many people. Expectations were wrong. What it actually delivers is a charming, strange action RPG that feels like it belongs to a different franchise entirely. The world is full of floating islands, cartoonish villains, and slapstick humor that constantly undercuts its own drama. I didn't take it seriously at first, but over time that silliness became part of its charm. There's something refreshing about a game that isn't afraid to be goofy while still giving you long dungeons, tricky puzzles, and meaningful progression. Combat is faster and more kinetic than its predecessor, with jumping, combos, and platforming all woven into exploration. Some of it can feel clumsy, especially when precision is required, and I definitely got frustrated during a few late game sections. Still, the variety kept me engaged, and I liked how often the game tried something new instead of repeating itself. Alundra 2 suffered from being judged against what it wasn't. Because it didn't match the tone of the original, it got dismissed. On its own terms, it's a colorful, ambitious PS1 RPG that deserved more patience than it received. Brigandine feels less like a typical RPG and more like a slow-burn war chronicle that you slowly write yourself. Instead of following one hero, you take control of an entire nation, watching generals, monsters, and political tensions collide over dozens of in-game months. What I found most striking is how little the game tries to dramatize this with cutscenes. It lets the weight of your decisions create the drama instead. Every kingdom has its own identity, rulers, and internal struggles, which immediately gives the campaign a sense of personality. Some leaders are idealistic, some are ruthless, and others feel trapped by the roles they inherited. Choosing who to play isn't just a cosmetic decision. It changes how the world reacts to you. And I like how that made each play through feel genuinely different rather than just remixed. Combat happens on tactical grids, but it's deeply tied to the larger map. You're constantly weighing whether to spread your forces thin to claim more land or consolidate to protect what you already own. I remember hesitating before major fights because losing a strong knight or rare monster wasn't just a setback, it could cripple an entire region of my empire. That risk gave every battle a kind of nervous tension that most RPGs don't have. The monster system adds another layer of strategy. You don't just recruit units, you raise and evolve them, slowly shaping an army that reflects your playstyle. Watching a creature grow stronger over time made me feel strangely attached to it, which only made losses hurt more when things went wrong. Brigandine did receive an English release, but it never found a wide audience, probably because it demands patience and long-term thinking. For players who enjoy RPGs where strategy, emotion, and consequence are tightly woven together, it remains one of the PS1's most quietly powerful experiences. Vanguard Bandits feels like one of those games that was too confident in its own depth to ever worry about being accessible. On the surface, it's a tactical RPG with mechs, but the longer I spent with it, the more it felt like a full political drama wrapped inside turn-based battles. The story splits into multiple routes depending on the choices you make, and those paths don't just change dialogue, they reshape the entire conflict. What stuck with me most was how personal the war felt. Characters don't just fight because the plot demands it. They argue, doubt themselves, and sometimes betray each other. I like how messy it all was. There's no clean moral high ground here, just people trying to survive, shifting alliances, and collapsing kingdoms. That made every decision feel heavier than I expected from a mech RPG. Combat is built around positioning, morale, and facing. Where you place a unit matters just as much as what it can do, and I found myself constantly thinking a few turns ahead instead of reacting. Watching a carefully planned maneuver pay off felt incredibly satisfying, especially when it prevented a stronger enemy from overwhelming me. The biggest hurdle is how dense it can feel at first. Menus are packed, tutorials are thin, and it assumes you're willing to learn through failure. But once it clicks, Vanguard Bandits becomes deeply rewarding. It was released in English, yet it slipped through the cracks, and that's unfortunate because it's one of the most thoughtful tactical RPGs on the system. Hoshigami is one of those PS1 RPGs that doesn't try to win you over. It challenges you to keep going. From the very beginning, the world feels worn down, full of people who aren't chasing glory so much as trying to survive another day. I remember being struck by how bleak it all felt, not in a dramatic fantasy way, but in a quiet, grinding kind of despair that made every decision feel heavy. The story revolves around soldiers, mercenaries, and ordinary people caught in political conflicts they barely understand. Nobody feels heroic in the traditional sense. Most of the cast is motivated by money, fear, or revenge, and that gives the narrative a raw edge that's rare for a console RPG from this era. I didn't always agree with what the characters did, but I always understood why they were pushed into it. The tactical combat is famously brutal. Positioning, turn order, and terrain all matter, and the game gives you very little room to recover from mistakes. I found myself studying the battlefield before committing to anything, because one reckless move could wipe out half my squad. That pressure made every successful fight feel like it was earned through careful thought rather than luck. Progression is slow and sometimes punishing, but it reinforces the tone. You're not meant to feel powerful. You're meant to feel like you're scraping by. When a character finally becomes reliable in battle, it feels meaningful because of how much they had to endure. Hoshigami did receive an English release, but its difficulty and unflinching mood made it easy to overlook. For players who want a tactical RPG that treats war as something exhausting and cruel, it remains one of the PS1's most haunting hidden experiences. Cardia feels like it came from a very different creative mood than most tactical RPGs of its era. Instead of heroic fantasy or war drama, it leans into something softer, stranger, and more introspective. The art style immediately sets it apart, with watercolor-like character portraits and delicate environments that feel almost storybook. I was surprised by how calm the game felt, even when it was dealing with betrayal and conflict. The story follows two protagonists whose paths overlap in complicated ways, letting you see the same events from opposing sides. That structure made the world feel more honest to me, because no one ever has the full truth. Each route slowly reframes what you thought you understood, and I found myself questioning characters I initially trusted. It's a quiet kind of narrative tension that works far better than loud twists. Gameplay revolves around summoning creatures through magical words, which gives battles a ritualistic rhythm. You're not just attacking enemies. You're shaping the field by calling beings into existence and using them to control space. Positioning matters a lot, and small choices ripple outward in ways that felt satisfying rather than punishing. Cardia doesn't rush you. Its pacing is patient, sometimes almost meditative, and that can be off-putting if you expect constant action. But I appreciated how much it respected mood and atmosphere. It feels like a game designed to be absorbed rather than conquered. While it did receive an English release, it was barely noticed, overshadowed by louder tactical RPGs. Cardia remains special because it dared to be gentle in a genre obsessed with intensity. Sayuki is one of those PS1 RPGs that feels like it quietly sidestepped everything people expected from the genre. Instead of building itself around dramatic cutscenes or emotional monologues, it turns Journey to the West into something closer to a strategic puzzle box. When I first played it, I kept waiting for it to become more traditional, but it never did, and that ended up being the reason it stuck with me. Every battle feels carefully constructed. You're rarely overwhelmed by enemy numbers, but you're constantly forced to think about space, movement, and how your characters interact with the environment. Some heroes are designed to block paths, others manipulate terrain, and a few exist purely to distort what the enemy thinks is safe. I liked how clever it made me feel when a small, well-timed move completely flipped a losing situation. The presentation is colorful and lighthearted, which hides how demanding the game actually is. There's very little hand-holding, and it expects you to learn through experimentation. I I remember failing early missions simply because I misunderstood how certain spells affected the map. Once that understanding clicked, though, the systems opened up in a really satisfying way. This game never tries to overwhelm you with stats or menus. Its depth comes from how all the pieces fit together on the battlefield. That design choice makes every victory feel earned rather than brute forced. It did get an English release, but it didn't make any noise, probably because its structure was so different from what tactical RPG fans are used to. For players who enjoy thoughtful, spatially driven combat, Sayuki still feels refreshingly strange.
I've known it for so long.
Rhapsody feels like a game that wasn't afraid to be emotionally sincere in a genre that usually hides behind epic stakes. It presents itself as a fairy tale musical, but beneath that bright surface is a surprisingly gentle story about growing up, disappointment, and letting go of idealized love. I went in expecting something shallow, and what I found instead was something quietly honest. Cornette, the main character, doesn't act like a typical RPG hero. She's awkward, overly romantic, and unsure of herself, which made her feel far more real to me than most protagonists. Her ability to talk to puppets gives the story a whimsical tone, but also allows the game to explore loneliness and self-doubt in a way that feels oddly intimate. Combat is turn-based and intentionally simple. The real joy comes from collecting puppets and monsters, each with their own personalities and quirks. Over time, your party starts to feel less like a battle team and more like a group of misfits traveling together, which made me care about them more than I expected. The musical numbers are risky, but they work because they're sincere. They're not trying to be cool. They're trying to be heartfelt. That vulnerability is what makes Rhapsody memorable. It did receive a Western release. It was often dismissed for being too cute. That's unfortunate, because behind the pastel colors is one of the PS1's most emotionally grounded RPGs. Tail Concerto is one of those PS1 games that feels like it slipped out of a completely different creative space than most RPGs of its time. It presents itself as a bright, cartoonish adventure about airships, sky islands, and anthropomorphic characters. But once you spend time with it, there's a surprising amount of heart beneath that playful surface. I went in expecting something lightweight, and what I found was a world that felt carefully imagined and emotionally warm. You play as a young police officer piloting a small mech, and instead of constant combat, the game focuses on chasing criminals, helping townsfolk, and uncovering the strange history of its floating civilization. That structure made the experience feel more like a Saturday morning adventure series than a traditional RPG, which I found oddly refreshing. It never felt like it was trying to impress me with scale. It was more interested in charm and momentum. Combat is real-time and simple, but it's built around capturing enemies rather than destroying them. I like how that reinforced the tone of the world. You're a law enforcer, not a warrior, and the game stays true to that idea even during boss fights. Exploration, light puzzles, and movement through vertical environments ended up being just as important as fighting. Tail Concerto was released late in the PS1's life, which meant almost nobody noticed it. That's a shame, because its gentle humor, expressive animation, and sincere tone make it feel like a hidden gem from a studio willing to be weird and kind at the same time. Eternal Eyes looks simple at first glance, but it hides a surprising amount of mechanical depth beneath its cute presentation. Instead of a huge cast of heroes, the game revolves around summoning monsters and shaping them into your real fighting force. I liked how that made progression feel more like nurturing than grinding. Each creature you summon can evolve into different forms, depending on how you use it and what items you feed it. Watching a monster slowly become something powerful gave me a sense of attachment that most RPG parties never really achieve. When one of them fell in battle, it actually hurt a little. The branching evolution paths reward experimentation, encouraging you to try different strategies rather than sticking to one dominant build. Battles take place on small tactical grids, which means positioning and planning matter far more than raw stats. I often found myself thinking several turns ahead, try to set up a monster in just the right place to control the field. That kind of pacing made fights feel thoughtful instead of chaotic. Elemental weaknesses and terrain effects add layers of complexity that aren't immediately obvious. The visuals are bright and charming, almost too cheerful for the tactical depth underneath. Some players might dismiss it as a kid's game based on presentation alone, which would be a mistake. The difficulty ramps up significantly in later chapters, demanding careful resource management and smart positioning. The story is light, but it provides just enough structure to keep everything moving. Eternal Eyes never tries to overwhelm you. It invites you into its systems slowly, letting curiosity do the work. It's the kind of game that grows on you quietly, which is probably why so many people missed it the first time around. Guardians Crusade feels like a warm, comforting RPG in a genre that often leans toward darkness and intensity. It tells the story of a young knight traveling the world with a small living doll, and that simple premise gives the game an almost storybook quality. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed that softer tone. Instead of endless menus and complex systems, the game focuses on exploration, discovery, and small moments of wonder. You find living toys that fight alongside you, and each one feels more like a companion than a tool. Collecting them became one of my favorite parts of the experience. The way they interact with the world, solving environmental puzzles or revealing hidden paths, made exploration feel genuinely rewarding rather than a series of random encounters. Combat is straightforward, but it never feels dull because the emphasis is on variety rather than difficulty. What really kept me engaged was this sense of curiosity, wondering what strange creature or hidden event I'd stumble into next. Boss fights are more about pattern recognition than grinding levels, which I appreciated. The relationship between the knight and the creature he's protecting evolves naturally throughout the journey. Small animations and interactions give their bond weight without relying on heavy dialogue. The world itself feels handcrafted, with towns and NPCs that have distinct personalities rather than feeling like copy-paste templates. Guardians Crusade was released quietly and didn't make much of splash, probably because it didn't try to be edgy or epic. For players who appreciate gentle storytelling and charming worlds, it remains one of the PS1's most endearing hidden RPGs.